A Karen's racist outburst in a hospital put her life in danger when she demanded a black doctor leave the room. But when tragedy struck, his selfless act shocked everyone and changed everything. You won't believe how this ends. It was a busy evening in the bustling ER of Parkwood Memorial Hospital. The waiting room buzzed with anxious conversations, the faint smell of antiseptic filling the air. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, their faces showing the weight of endless shifts and lives in their hands. Among the controlled chaos, Dr. Marcus Carter, a black physician known for his calm demeanor and unmatched skill, hurried between rooms. His soft-spoken words and steady hands had earned him respect from his colleagues and gratitude from countless patients. In one corner of the waiting room sat Karen Whitmore, her face flushed with frustration. A woman in her late 40s, she was dressed impeccably, her designer handbag resting on her lap as if it were a symbol of her importance. She had come to the hospital complaining of severe chest pain, but her impatience overshadowed her discomfort. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the diverse staff and patients, her expression growing colder by the second. "Excuse me," Karen's sharp voice cut through the noise, grabbing the attention of a nearby nurse. "How much longer am I supposed to wait? I'm in pain. Do you know who I am?" The nurse, a young woman with tired eyes, offered an apologetic smile. "Ma'am, we're doing our best. A doctor will see you as soon as possible." Karen sighed dramatically, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is unacceptable. Do I have to call someone to get proper treatment around here?" Moments later, the nurse returned with Dr. Carter, who entered the room with an air of professionalism and calm. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his deep voice steady and reassuring. "I understand you've been experiencing chest pain. Let's get you examined right away." Karen's eyes narrowed as she took in the tall man standing before her. His dark skin, the badge on his white coat reading Dr. Marcus Carter, and his confident presence seemed to ignite something in her. She crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. "Wait," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "You're the doctor? Are there no other doctors available?" Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow but kept his tone even. "I'm the attending physician tonight, ma'am. I assure you, you're in good hands." Karen shook her head, her voice rising. "I'd prefer someone else. Someone with more experience." Her words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. The nurse's face turned red with embarrassment, while the other patients in the waiting room exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dr. Carter remained composed, his professional facade unshaken. "Mrs. Whitmore, my only concern is your health. If you're in pain, I'd like to help you immediately. Delaying could be dangerous." Karen scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Dangerous? Please, I'll wait for another doctor." The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Carter nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. "If that's your decision," he said quietly. Turning to the nurse, he added, "Please let me know if Mrs. Whitmore changes her mind." As Dr. Carter walked away, Karen muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable. I pay taxes for this?" The words stung those who overheard, but no one dared confront her. Yet Karen's dismissal of Dr. Carter wasn't just an insult. It was a decision that would come back to haunt her in ways she could never imagine. Minutes ticked by in the waiting room, each one feeling longer than the last. Karen sat with her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. The murmurs of concern from other patients only irritated her further. Her chest pains, which had started as a dull ache, were now intensifying, each breath feeling heavier than the last. But her pride wouldn't allow her to reconsider. Across the hospital, Dr. Marcus Carter was busy attending to a young boy who had been rushed in after a bike accident. Despite Karen's refusal, he didn't let her words linger in his mind. After all, this wasn't the first time he'd faced blatant prejudice. Growing up, he'd been told by more people than he cared to remember that he didn't fit the image of a doctor. But Marcus had learned to rise above it. He poured himself into his work, believing that his skill and compassion would speak louder than any bias. Still, as he worked on stitching the boy's wound, Marcus couldn't help but think back to Karen's expression. One of dismissal, judgment, and fear. A moment of bitterness rose in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. There was no time for anger in a place where every second mattered. Suddenly, the sound of frantic footsteps and a sharp voice calling for help broke through the quiet hum of the ER. A nurse sprinted down the hallway, her face pale. "Dr. Carter," she shouted. "It's Mrs. Whitmore. Her condition just took a turn for the worse." Marcus froze for only a fraction of a second before his training kicked in. He passed the young boy's care to another physician and raced toward Karen's room. His long strides were purposeful, his mind already running through possibilities. When he entered the room, the scene was dire. Karen was slumped over on the hospital bed, her breathing shallow and labored. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her once sharp voice was now a faint, panicked whisper. "I can't breathe," she managed to choke out. The nurse looked at Marcus with urgency. Her blood pressure's dropping fast, and she's showing signs of a myocardial infarction. A heart attack. Marcus immediately sprang into action. "Get me 300 milligrams of aspirin and prepare the defibrillator," he instructed, calmly but firmly. As the nurse rushed to comply, Marcus knelt beside Karen, his voice low and steady. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're having a heart attack. I need you to trust me now. We're going to do everything we can, but I need your cooperation." Karen's eyes widened with fear, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to speak. I didn't mean," she started, but Marcus cut her off gently. "Save your energy," he said, placing an oxygen mask over her face. "We're going to get through this." His voice was soothing, yet his hands moved with precision and urgency. The beeping of monitors quickened as Karen's condition worsened. Marcus administered the aspirin, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions beneath the surface. The defibrillator was brought in, and the room grew even tenser. Marcus checked her pulse and blood pressure again, his expression unreadable but focused. He didn't care about her earlier words or the sting of her prejudice. Right now, all that mattered was saving her life. "Clear," Marcus called out as he pressed the paddles to her chest. Karen's body jolted as the electric shock coursed through her. The monitor beeped erratically for a moment before stabilizing slightly. The nurse exhaled in relief. "Her vitals are improving." Marcus nodded but didn't let his guard down. "We're not out of the woods yet. Prepare her for transfer to the cath lab immediately." He glanced at Karen, who was now semi-conscious, her fearful eyes meeting his. "You're going to be okay," he said firmly. And for the first time that evening, Karen nodded, the fight draining from her as she allowed herself to trust him. The atmosphere in the cath lab was tense but focused. A team of specialists worked under Dr. Marcus Carter's direction as they prepared to clear the blockage in Karen's artery. Her earlier panic had faded into exhaustion, and though her face was pale, her eyes stayed fixed on Marcus. She was no longer the haughty, dismissive woman from the waiting room. Now, she was a patient, vulnerable, and dependent on the very person she had tried to reject. As the procedure began, Karen's mind raced despite her weakened state. Flashes of her earlier words came back to her, each one hitting harder than the last. Are there no other doctors? Her dismissal of him had been so casual, so automatic, and now here he was, standing between her and death itself. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but the oxygen mask and the wires hooked up to her chest made it impossible. All she could do was watch Marcus, who moved with an unwavering determination. His every action was deliberate, his every instruction calm and clear. As the team worked, Marcus narrated softly to the nurses, his tone steady. "The blockage is significant, but we've caught it in time. The stent will restore blood flow." Though he was speaking to the staff, Karen heard every word, caught it in time. Those 4 words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in years, she felt a deep, raw gratitude she couldn't articulate. It wasn't long before the procedure was complete. The blockage was cleared, and Karen's heart began to stabilize. Marcus removed his gloves, looking at the monitors one last time before addressing the team. Vitals are steady. She's out of immediate danger. Let's move her to recovery. As Karen was wheeled out of the lab and into a quiet recovery room, she couldn't stop her tears. Lying in the sterile bed, she stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in her mind. The frustration, the arrogance, the unbearable chest pain, and now this. A second chance at life, given to her by the very man she had treated so cruelly. Marcus entered the room quietly, his expression soft but professional. He carried her chart in one hand, and a warm but weary look in his eyes. Karen turned her head toward him, struggling to find the words to say. "You're going to be fine, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice low but reassuring. "We've stabilized your heart, but you'll need to make some lifestyle changes. I'll explain everything when you're stronger." Karen's lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Carter." She paused, her throat tightening with emotion. I owe you my life. I'm so sorry for everything I said. I was wrong." Marcus hesitated for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the weight of the realization she was carrying. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone even. "My job is to save lives, no matter what. That's what I did for you today." Tears streamed down Karen's face as she nodded, her chest heaving with sobs. "I judged you, without knowing anything about you. And yet, you saved me." Marcus stood quietly for a moment, his calm presence filling the room. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we all need to be reminded that what's on the surface doesn't define what's underneath. Rest now, and focus on getting better." Karen nodded, her gratitude palpable, though her tears continued to fall. Marcus turned and left the room, but the words he had spoken lingered with her, cutting deeper than any reprimand ever could. She realized this wasn't just about her survival. It was about something far greater. As Karen lay in the quiet of the recovery room, she made a silent promise to herself. When she walked out of this hospital, she would be a different person. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds in Karen's recovery room, casting soft streaks of gold across the walls. She lay still, her body weak but her mind alive with thoughts. Every beat of her heart felt like a gift, a second chance she hadn't deserved, but had been given anyway. The words of Dr. Carter echoed in her ears. We all need to be reminded that what's on the surface doesn't define what's underneath. Karen replayed the events of the previous day over and over in her mind. The way she had dismissed Marcus simply because of the color of his skin, the words she had thrown at him without a second thought, and his calm, unwavering professionalism in the face of it all. She had always seen herself as someone who wasn't racist. She had friends of different races, didn't tolerate slurs, and told herself she treated everyone equally. But now she realized how deeply her own biases had been buried beneath the surface, only surfacing in moments when her guard was down. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It opened slowly, and Marcus stepped in, clipboard in hand. He was back in his crisp white coat, his calm expression as steady as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "How are you feeling today?" Karen tried to smile, but her lips trembled. I'm better thanks to you." Marcus nodded, checking her chart. "Your vitals are stable. You're responding well to treatment, but I'd like to keep you under observation for another day or two, just to be safe." Karen hesitated before speaking, her voice soft. "Dr. Carter, may I say something?" Marcus lowered the clipboard and met her gaze, his expression open but reserved. "Of course." Tears welled in Karen's eyes as she spoke. "I don't know how to put this into words, but I judged you in the worst way possible. I assumed things about you that I had no right to assume. And yet, you saved me. You saved me without hesitation, without anger, without holding any of it against me. How do I even begin to thank you? Marcus studied her for a moment, his face thoughtful. He had heard apologies like this before, but there was something raw in Karen's voice that told him this wasn't just a surface-level regret. This was someone confronting a part of herself she didn't want to see. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, his voice calm, "I appreciate your words. But gratitude isn't what I'm looking for. What matters more to me is what you do with this second chance. We all make mistakes. What defines us is how we grow from them." Karen nodded slowly, his words sinking in like water to dry soil. "I want to do better," she said quietly. "I need to." A small smile tugged at the corners of Marcus's lips. "That's a good start." He placed the clipboard back on the table and stood. "Get some rest. I'll be back later to check on you." As he turned to leave, Karen's voice stopped him. "Dr. Carter, I want you to know that what you did, how you treated me, it's changed something in me. I see things differently now." Marcus turned back, his expression warm but measured. "I'm glad to hear that," he said gently. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Whitmore." When the door closed behind him, Karen lay back against the pillows, her heart heavy but hopeful. For the first time in years, she felt a deep desire to change, not just for herself, but for the world she wanted to be a part of. She thought of the nurse she had spoken so harshly to, of the diverse faces she had overlooked in the waiting room, and of the doctor who had saved her life without letting her prejudice define his actions. Weeks after her discharge from the hospital, Karen Whitmore found herself standing in front of the mirror at home, staring into her own reflection. Physically, she had recovered well. Her chest pains were gone, and the scars from the procedure were healing. But emotionally, she knew she was a different person. Her heart wasn't just stronger, it was changed in a deeper, more profound way. The world outside her window seemed different too. The same streets she had walked on for years now felt more vibrant, alive with people whose stories she had ignored for so long. She was determined to live her second chance with purpose, to make amends for the person she had been. Her first step was writing a letter. Sitting at her kitchen table, she carefully folded the piece of paper she had rewritten 3 times, each draft spilling with more sincerity than the last. The letter was addressed to Dr. Marcus Carter. "Dear Dr. Carter, I don't know if words can truly express the gratitude I feel, but I need to try. You didn't just save my life in the hospital that day. You showed me who I really was, and it wasn't who I thought I was. I judged you unfairly, spoke to you with arrogance, and dismissed you without reason. Yet when my life was on the line, you treated me with the compassion and dignity I denied you. I will never forget your kindness and professionalism. You've inspired me to do more with this second chance I've been given. I've spent my entire life thinking of the world in terms of us and them. But now I see that we're all just people, flawed, complicated, but capable of extraordinary grace. Thank you for saving me, not just physically but emotionally too. You've reminded me of the kind of person I want to be. With deep gratitude, Karen Whitmore." Karen mailed the letter the next day, feeling lighter as she sealed the envelope. But she didn't stop there. She knew that true change required action, not just words. Over the following weeks, Karen sought out ways to educate herself, reading books and attending workshops on unconscious bias and systemic racism. She volunteered at community centers, listening to stories she had once dismissed as not her problem. Slowly, she began to understand the privilege she had taken for granted her entire life. One Saturday morning, Karen found herself at a health and wellness event hosted by Parkwood Memorial Hospital. She was nervous, clutching the program in her hands as she scanned the crowd. In the distance, she spotted a familiar figure, tall, composed, and unmistakable. It was Dr. Marcus Carter, speaking to a small group of medical students about the importance of empathy in healthcare. Karen hesitated, unsure if she should approach him. But then she remembered his words from the hospital. What matters is what you do with this second chance. Summoning her courage, she walked toward him, her heart racing. "Dr. Carter," she said softly when he turned to her. His expression shifted slightly as he recognized her, his eyes showing a mix of surprise and warmth. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, offering a polite smile. "It's good to see you. How have you been?" "I've been good," Karen replied, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "And I have you to thank for that. I just wanted to say, in person this time, thank you." Marcus nodded, his expression kind but measured. "I'm glad to see you're doing well. That's what matters most." Karen hesitated, then added, "I've been working on being better, on seeing people for who they are, not what I assume about them. It's a work in progress, but I thought you should know that you changed more than just my health that day." Marcus studied her for a moment, then offered a small but genuine smile. "That's good to hear, Mrs. Whitmore. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it." As they parted ways, Karen felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She had faced her flaws, made amends, and found a path forward. Dr. Carter had given her more than a second chance at life. He had given her the courage to live it differently. Karen's story became a testament to the power of compassion and the capacity for personal transformation. In the end, it wasn't just about a doctor saving a life. It was about a moment of grace that rippled outward, changing more than one heart in the process.